Welcome to the Megillah Project.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
I remember when I was about 6 years old, dressing up for my school's Purim carnival as Mordecai, the hero of the story of Purim. Now, at that point in my life, I could have never imagined that there was a rabbi in the Talmud, in fact, one of the most prominent rabbis in the Talmud, who actually thought that Mordecai was a villain in the story of Purim. Now, that thought was not intuitive to me as a 6-year-old, and it certainly hasn't been intuitive to me for even my adult life. The way I came to it was really by trying to understand the origins of the custom of drinking alcohol on the holiday of Purim. Now, this custom was familiar to me from a young age. It's pretty prominent in many Jewish communities, but I never really wanted to understand its origins as much as I did until I was in yeshiva in Jerusalem in the year between high school and college. And what struck me at that point was just how intense this was for so many people, that people were really taking this custom of drinking to an extreme. And I just wanted to understand, how did this come about? It really did not seem to make sense to me in an intuitive way. And what I began to do was really to dig deep into the Talmud to understand where this custom came from. Now, the first thing that I found, and that many people have seen, is that the custom originates with a saying attributed to a rabbi from the Talmud named Rava, who's actually the most cited rabbi in the Talmud. And that saying is that a person should drink on Purim until they can't tell the difference between cursing Haman and blessing Mordecai. Now, the way this prescription had been explained to me from a pretty young age was that this was just a way of saying to get really, really drunk on Purim, that Mordecai was the hero, Haman was the villain, and so if you can't tell the difference between blessing the hero and cursing the villain, that must mean that you're really, really messed up on alcohol, and that's the goal of what Rava was trying to get at. And there's some different explanations of why Rava might say something like this. Some of them have to do with the idea that Purim is a day on which we turn things upside down and we want to see things differently than they normally are. Other interpretations have been about the fact that wine plays a prominent role in the story of Purim in the book of Esther, and so we're trying to step into that theme. But none of that really, really made sense to me, because this idea of drinking specifically on this holiday and having this specific measurement to which we were supposed to drink seemed to have something more behind it. And once I wanted to get an understanding of that something more, that's where I started to found the interpretations that I was finding coming short, because they didn't really dig deep into what Rava meant. And I think part of that had to do with the fact that they were isolated to that one statement. And so what I really wanted to do was understand Rava as a person, not just as a figure making this one statement, but as a brilliant Talmudic figure who had a worldview, who had views about many different issues, what this might be stemming from. And so what I did was I searched throughout the Talmud to understand what Rava's views were on drinking alcohol in general, on the story of Purim, and on the particular characters of Mordecai and Haman, who are the two central figures in the statement that he makes. Now, just to recap, it's important to just share the classical view of the story so that we're all on the same page with what the general view is about these two figures. So while the book of Esther contains many different components, the general idea between these two figures is that Mordecai and Haman and Haman are two figures in the king's court, in Ahasuerus's court. And what eventually happens is that Haman gets a promotion. He becomes effectively the second in command to the king, and he orders that everyone in the king's court bows down to him. Now, Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. Haman is enraged. once he discovers that Mordecai is a Jew, and he has given that reason for why he hasn't bowed down to Haman, Haman decides that his goal is to kill all of the Jews in Persia. The way the rest of the story unfolds is a whole upturning of events, such that in the end, Haman isn't able to kill all the Jews, and through Mordecai's cousin Esther, and a working together between Mordecai and Esther, but really Esther taking the lead, they're able to get the king to allow them to overturn or really work against Haman's decree. And instead of the Jews being killed, they're able to take revenge against all those that were trying to kill them. So that's the classic story. Now, with that as background, what I began to find when I was searching through Rava's statements was a very, very different view. And it all started with really understanding what his views were on alcohol in general. So again, the way I had always understood the custom of drinking on Purim growing up was that we wanted to get so drunk that our distinctions between good and bad were so blurry, we really can't tell the difference between them. But one of the first things I found is that Rava makes a statement in the Talmud that alcohol actually helps people see things more clearly. Now, that's the total opposite of drinking alcohol to get to the point of blurring distinctions between good and evil. Now, this shook things up a little bit more, because why on earth would Rava want us to actually use alcohol to sharpen our distinctions, and then to say, you know what, once we sharpen our distinctions, we actually only then can't tell a difference between the good guy and the bad guy in the Purim story? Now, that alone was shocking enough. But when I began to search the Talmud more, Rava's other statements about Mordecai and Haman became even more shocking. So just to give a taste of a few of these. Early on in the book of Esther, there's a party that happens where the king invites all of his court, and it's really this wild, wild party. Now, in the Talmud, almost all of the rabbis, there's actually, I'm not familiar with any views in the Talmud that see this otherwise, that party is viewed as a horrible, horrible place. There's actually a statement in the Talmud that says that because of anyone who participated in that party was worthy of death. It was that terrible of a place. Now, with that as context, Rava gives a very creative reading of a verse, which really is not at all implicit in the text, and suggests that both Mordecai and Haman were responsible for alcohol at this party. So what he does is, in a really, again, creative interpretation, he places Mordecai and Haman together at this party and places them as responsible for alcohol at this really, in the views of the rabbis, terrible, terrible place. So that's already shocking. What's he doing trying to put Mordecai and Haman on equal footing at this party? That was one. Another statement that comes up that is really shocking is when it's describing who Mordecai was. It says that he was exiled from Jerusalem. The Hebrew verb that's used is the passive voice, that it happened to him that Mordecai was with those who were exiled from Jerusalem. Now, Rava gives this, again, interpretation that is not at all a straightforward reading of the text, and says that Mordecai exiled himself. Now, Jerusalem is the holiest place in the world in Jewish tradition, and here Rava is saying that Mordecai decided to voluntarily abandon Jerusalem. Again, he's taking Mordecai and sort of knocking him down from this status of hero. Then there's this other statement. Part of the story of what happens is that Mordecai foils an assassination plot against the king, and then he's rewarded by Haman parading him around town. And it's sort of this, again, upending of Mordecai, who is being persecuted by Haman or trying to be persecuted. Haman now has to lead him around town. So seemingly this is the good guy being victorious over the bad guy. But what Rava, again, this rabbi from the Talmud, does is he finds this interpretation to say the reason that Mordecai is paraded around is not because we love Mordecai, it's rather that we just hate Haman. And so there's not this goal of really trying to elevate Mordecai again. It's about knocking him down. So all this didn't make sense. I could not understand, really, I could not think of a reason why Rava would want to treat Mordecai this way. The way I'd always studied the story was that here Mordecai was a pious Jew, a proud Jew, who was refusing to bow down to a non-Jew against his beliefs. There is a teaching that I was very familiar with growing up from the way I'd studied Talmud, that in general, a Jew should always do everything in their power to live, including violating the rules, the commandments of the Torah, except for three things. Those three things being not to kill someone else, not to engage in prohibited sexual relationships, and finally, not to worship idolatry. And so this was, as I had always been taught, a form of idolatry. By worshiping Haman, Mordecai would have been violating a cardinal sin, and therefore, of course, he was not only standing up for Judaism, he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. So I could not understand why Rava kept trying to knock him down a few pegs. But then there was this statement I found that was the most shocking of all, which was that Rava actually says that it would have been a good thing if Haman's ancestors would have been killed. No shocker there. Haman is this genocidal maniac who wants to kill the Jews. So of course we would have wanted his ancestors to be killed. That way he would have never been born. But then Rava makes this even really unfathomable statement, which is that it would have been a good thing if Mordecai's ancestors would have been killed, and that way Mordecai would have never been born. Now, that is a harsh statement to make about someone, that the goal or that the hope is that they would have never been alive. Now, you don't say that about a hero. So it became really clear to me that when Rava said that the goal was to drink on Purim until not distinguishing between blessing Mordecai and cursing Haman, that he wasn't saying to get so messed up that you can't see the difference between good and evil. He was actually asking us to question what it was we thought was good and what it was we thought was evil. Now, that still didn't fully make sense to me, because how could Rava go against this central teaching that we just talked about, where worshiping idolatry is one of the worst things you can do in Jewish tradition, and it's so bad that it's one of the three cardinal sins that someone should die rather than transgress. So this is where things really took a turn to be even more surprising. And part of this was really trying to understand Rava as his own particular figure in the Talmud, and not sort of this flattening of the rabbis say or the Talmud says. Because part of what the Talmud does is it captures the views of different rabbis, and if we look at those views, they don't come back to back to back, but if we find those views throughout the Talmud and then put them together, what we see emerge is that the individual rabbis are three-dimensional people with complex worldviews, and they're actually disagreeing with each other. And so once I began to look at Rava's views, one of the things that I found was totally separate from his views on Purim is that he actually is a dissenting voice in this understanding of what it means to worship idolatry and viewing that as a cardinal sin. And according to Rava, idolatry is a matter of the heart. You can't worship idolatry if you don't really believe what you're doing. And so if someone is forcing you to worship idolatry under duress and threatening you with your life, and that's the only reason you're worshiping idolatry, so of course you're not really worshiping idolatry. And therefore, if you're not really worshiping idolatry, there's no problem in doing that in order to save your life. Now, all the more so if the goal of what you're doing is to save the entire Jewish people. So all of a sudden, things started to click. For Rava, Mordecai is not only doing something that's somewhat problematic, he's actually violating a core principle of Jewish law, because there's not only an idea of to not violate those three things, there's a goal of living and celebrating life. And if you're not celebrating life and not trying to preserve life, that itself is a problem. And so here was Mordecai, who was willing to risk his life and risk the life of the entire Jewish people not to bow down to Haman. Now, all of a sudden, it also began to make sense. Why was Rava making these statements about Mordecai earlier in the story? If we go back to the beginning, all of a sudden we see that according to Rava, Mordecai and Haman were both ministers of equal footing at the king's party. Now, both of them were in a place that they should not have been, according to Rava. So Mordecai is not a great guy to begin with, and he's sort of just like another guy in the king's court trying to compete for his place. Now, all of a sudden, his competitor gets promoted. And the reason, presumably, although Rava doesn't say this explicitly, but based on everything he's saying, presumably the reason that Rava sees he didn't want to bow down was not because he thought it was a prohibited form of idolatry, but because he was proud for himself. It was his ego. And therefore, he pinned that on this Jewish stuff as a way of defending himself without really regard for what the implications would be for the rest of the Jewish people. So that really was just shocking to discover, that Mordecai would have this totally different perception in the eyes of Rava as being effectively a villain and not a hero. Now, once I began to understand that all of a sudden flipped the entire holiday of Purim on its head. If Mordecai isn't a hero, and if what happened was that we had this sort of egotistical guy who blames his own egoism on his Judaism, and therefore the Jews are pursued by a genocidal maniac, but then they get out of it at the end, that's a sort of different story than one of just random persecution of the Jews, which is unavoidable and terrible and so on and so forth. And then I found this statement by Rava, again, the same rabbi, where he effectively says that. And that was really just shocking. There's generally a prayer that's said on very happy Jewish holidays called Hallel, which is a prayer of praise. And that holiday, that prayer is said on most very happy Jewish holidays, but it's not said on the holiday of Purim. And so the Talmud engages in this debate, well, why don't we say it on Purim? And there's a whole bunch of different views. One of them is that, well, reading the Megillah is a way of giving that praise, so we don't need to say Hallel. But Rava gives a different view. And Rava doesn't say, well, we do this other really happy thing, so we don't need to say Hallel. What he says is, when we compare it to Passover, for example, which is one holiday when we do recite Hallel, what happened on Passover? The Jews were slaves of Pharaoh, and then they become, in the language there, slaves of God. But what is meant is they were in this terrible position, and then they were effectively freed to serve God. So they went from real slavery to freedom. But what happens in the book of Esther, in the story of Purim? They were slaves of Achashverosh. They were servants of the Persian kingdom. And what happens after? They're servants of the Persian kingdom of Achashverosh. So effectively, the net is still zero. They didn't come into some major form of redemption. Now, if we really read this and layer upon it the story, what happens with Esther and the place that she puts herself in and the risks she takes, Mordecai's hypocrisy becomes even greater and greater. And so there are many, many implications of this, certainly for the custom of drinking on Purim, but much more broadly for the way in which we understand Purim as a holiday. We often have I think, a very narrow view, first of all, of how we understand Talmudic figures, that we see them as giving isolated statements in certain contexts. And then at the end of the day, what we want to ask is, well, what does the Talmud say? And I think what this pushes us to do is to really understand what these figures, what their worldviews were across the board. And I think that gives us a much richer understanding of them as people, but also of their views, and in this case, of the holiday. And in particular, I think what this offers us for the holiday of Purim is that there's this idea on Purim of v'nahafochu, that everything gets turned upside down. But we actually have a pretty narrow understanding of what that means. On this one day of the year, we pretend that the way things normally are is a little bit different, but we know that we're playing a game. We know that we're pretending, and then the next day after Purim's over, things go back to normal. I think what Rava is asking us to think about on Purim is that what we thought we knew about who's good, who's bad, what's right, what's wrong, may not be so obvious. And that what we really need to do is question our assumptions. We need to dig deeper. And that Purim is an invitation to really go deep in that regard. And so when you encounter that teaching or that custom of drinking on Purim, I hope that you reflect and consider all the different ways in which its origins are an invitation, not just for this one day of Purim or not for just for this one moment, but really to explore the questions of good, of evil, of right and wrong in our lives and in the world.